In the last few years of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, there were still major conflicts going on in Europe, but there were more than just European conflicts at the time that would lead to future conflicts. The British and the French were still fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and they had their own discretions. However, in North America, and in the United States in particular, you had increasing westward expansion that forced Native Americans from their livelihoods and their homes. So, one way that could possibly help Native Americans would be to ally with British Canada. Hmm, okay. So, by allying with British Canada, you might weaken American westward expansion that had threatened tribes, and you might be able to resist some of this new white settlement. So, increased connections with Native Americans and British forces in Canada, and then eventually Spanish forces in Florida, would lead to an eventual conflict with the British yet again. But things slowly started on the high seas, even as France and Britain were conducting their wars overseas. Both France and Britain did not want the United States to trade and partner with the other. So they oftentimes would block American ports, or they would block American ships from reaching various different destinations to potentially get to their rival. They would oftentimes basically stop British ships, or I'm sorry, American ships on the high seas, and would impress some of the merchant marines. Now, of particular interest for the British were former Brits who expatriated and became naturalized Americans. That was pretty common at the time. And one of the reasons why is the British Navy sucked. It was a terrible existence. They even named themselves, they gave themselves the nickname, the British Navy, the floating hell. It was not a very good life. Okay, it was quite rough. And it was not uncommon for many British sailors to desert and make their way to the United States and become naturalized. Well, if you're the British Navy, one of the things that you might do upon seizing an American merchant ship is to perhaps encounter former Brits who've been naturalized Americans and impress them or re impress them into British naval service again. So the term impress, in this particular instance, it's not like, hey, look, I've got big muscles, pretty lady. What do you think of me? I'm trying to impress you. No, that's different. In this case, the word impress means to force into service. So, targets, the most common targets for the British Navy for re-impressment or impressment in general are those who were born in Britain and left and became naturalized. Generally speaking, they did not target former colonials or Americans. They targeted Brits who left, or those who may have perhaps deserted the British Navy in attempted naturalization in America. Okay? Either of which, that did not sit well with the United States. Okay? Even though the British Navy was not targeting American citizens in general, oftentimes they made very different distinctions. And things kind of came to a head with the Chesapeake Leopard incident in 1807. Out of the port at Norfolk, Virginia, the Chesapeake, an American merchant ship, set sail and was encountered by the British naval ship the Leopard in the open seas. And the Leopard, upon attempt to inspect the Chesapeake resisted. You have no right to do that. Well, the commanders of the Leopard did not take that so well, and they opened fire on the Chesapeake. And in doing so, the Chesapeake had to surrender, and The four naturalized British Americans now that were on board were captured and impressed into British naval service. Upon hearing that, Washington obviously threw a pretty big fit. You are basically hijacking American troops on the open, or American vessels on the open seas, and you are impressing new naturalized Americans who may have formerly been British into your service. They're no longer British, but the point is clear. You are attempting to impress into naval service Americans. And you're doing so because your numbers are terrible. Nobody wants to serve in the British Navy. You call it yourself the floating hell. Yeah, that's a problem. And we've got to do something about that. And when the United States contacted James Monroe, the American diplomat in London, he pressured the British government to end impressment, and they largely agreed. They're like, you know what, this is not right. We're sorry. We will compensate you for some of the losses in the Chesapeake. We'll return 3 of the 4 men, and unfortunately, it's only 3 because one of them was hanged. Yeah, that's not going to be good. But the British government refused to renounce the idea of impressing former British citizens. That became a point of contention. And that drastic measure and that enactment, that Chesapeake Leopard incident, started to get the American mindset on the brink of a war with Britain. Okay? Britain is taking advantage of various different things so as to squelch their French rival. But in the meantime, Americans are getting caught in the middle. No, that's not good. Okay? So, Thomas Jefferson persuaded Congress to pass the Embargo Act, which prohibited all foreign trade. Wait a second there. You're going to put an embargo on all foreign trade. That's going to kill markets, especially those in the Northeast, largely dominated by Federalists. Well, that's not real good, and that's not going to be real popular. In 1808, when their new election would come about, of which Thomas Jefferson could not play part, James Madison, the Republican candidate, ran against Charles Pinckney, that guy, of the Pinckney Treaty. James Madison won the election, but he had to revoke much of this embargo talk because clearly the Embargo Act was going to be a political liability for Federalists. Okay? That would give Federalists ammunition to really strike down anything that James Madison could do. Okay? So, you have Jefferson's embargo. Eventually, James Madison would get rid of it. Okay? So, what James Madison would do in this instance, so as to drive a point home, while trying to please Federalist markets and Northeast territories, and also sending a message to both Britain and France, he passes the Non-Intercourse Act. Now, I chuckle every time I hear that, the Non-Intercourse Act. It's a curious name, the Non-Intercourse Act. Okay. I can think of 1,000 jokes for that, and I'll leave it up to you and to your respective imaginations for what that may mean. But James Madison, with his Non-Intercourse Act, basically meant that we could allow trade, but we're going to put an embargo on all British and French products. We're not going to trade with either one of them. We want to appear to be somewhat neutral in their particular engagements, even though one of them's being a bit more harsh. We are trying to demonstrate an opportunity to somehow take advantage of the situation. Basically, we're prohibiting relations commercially with those two nations. Okay? You're going to stop impressing Americans, and you're going to stop um, seizing American ships on the high seas. We're just not going to trade with you. Okay? But um, so as not to hurt merchants elsewhere, we're going to do something about it too. We're going to trade it. We're going to trade elsewhere, specifically in the Caribbean, most likely. Otherwise, though, London responded by, um, okay, a possibility of perhaps maybe having an embargo on British ships alone. Okay, the British set up a blockade of various different European seaports that would force American ships in a struggle against trade elsewhere in Europe. So um, there was an attempt at repeal, but the relationship damage had somewhat already been done. And there were other things going on that further inflamed the situation. Let's go back to America. Native Americans moving, or white settlers moving west into Native American territories. Um, the sheer volume of white settlers moving west into newly acquired territories would eventually far outweigh Native Americans. And the Native Americans, many of whom and most of whom sided with the British in the American Revolution, still favored the English for various levels of protection. The English up in Canada, the English that still had outposts elsewhere in random parts of North America. They relied on the British for the fur trade and other trades as well. Um, the Chesapeake Leonard incident, remember that was in the seas, actually affected Native American relations inward, because now the United States was skeptical of the British, and now they saw these Native Americans that they're trying to move out as buddying up with the British up in Canada. Something's going to have to happen in that regard. Okay, so you have various different politicians, one of which is William Henry Harrison, who would eventually become president of the United States. Um, they would advocate for various different removal, but also various different assimilation attempts. See, there were a couple different things that folks like William Henry Harrison and even Thomas Jefferson himself believed. That either A, Native Americans should assimilate into white society, or they should move into territories that would be predominantly out of the way. They would leave the United States, maybe move into territories west of the Louisiana Purchase, and therefore just you have yours, we'll have this new stuff. You'll be out of our hair, and we'll be out of yours. Okay. Neither of them were a good solution for Native Americans. Okay, but that was the belief mindset at the time, especially because these Native Americans were buddying up with somebody who's pressuring the United States, the British. That's causing a problem. Okay, increasingly, Native Americans would look to Canada for various different levels of protection. Remember now, Canada is controlled by the British and has been since the French and Indian Wars end. Okay? The British are the Native Americans' best ally. They're the lesser of two evils. Okay? It became obvious to various different American politicians and American citizens in general that in order to squelch this Native American situation, there likely has to be something that would give, in this case, a possible annexation of Canada. Yeah. In order to get the British out and therefore end that alliance between Native Americans and the British, we need to just end Britain altogether here over here. Never mind for our own country. We just need to annex Canada. So there was building pressure to do that. And then Not only that, but you had Native Americans in the American South, Georgia, and the territories that would eventually become uh, Alabama and Mississippi, and around there too. So south of there lies Florida. Florida is still a Spanish territory and has been since the 1600s or 1500s perhaps. And those in those southernmost American territories, oftentimes, especially along the border with Spanish Florida, fell victim to raids from Native Americans who would come into the United States, raid, and then go back into Spanish Florida and hide. It would also be a haven for slaves looking to escape from the doldrums of slavery in the American South. Well, now, there now became increasing pressure to do something about Florida. And in this case, since Spain and Britain were reasonable allies, how about we do something against that and annex Florida too? What you're starting to see here is a pressure now to build a call for war with Britain. You have a reason to add territory, and this reason is to eliminate the Native American threat that exists to your potential westward, or in this case also southern growth. You would potentially consider an annexation of Canada and an annexation of Spanish Florida. You would also send a message to other European powers that you are, in effect, strong on your own accord, and you're not to be messed with. And things seem to go well. President James Madison is very reluctant to have a war with Britain. He really does not want one. Okay? But the mounting pressure from people who were interested in war, in this case war hawks, was so big that eventually James Madison would approve Congress's declaration of war. And Britain sees this declaration of war and they're like, oh, okay, well, that's nice, whatever. We're still fighting Napoleon over here. So they have resources committed to fighting Napoleon's army until Napoleon makes a terrible mistake. He invades Russia, and he does so in a bitterly cold winter. And his army gets decimated by Russians. Okay. Seeing that now Napoleon's army is falling apart and his empire is likewise falling apart, Britain can now reallocate its resources. Oh, yeah, you silly Americans. You silly Americans, you declared war on us. Okay, we'll see you. I see you, chap. All right. Britain now gets its act together, and they're coming back for us. They see our call to war, they're going to match us. We're going to war with Britain again.